So with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce Melinda and Andrea, who are our speakers today. If you guys would like to take just a moment to go ahead and pull up your presentations, I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and rather than having me do a big long intro, I thought let's have them introduce themselves, and then they can tell you a little bit more about both themselves and their company. So with that, I'd like to hand it off to them.
I'm starting. Is that what we said, Andrew? Sorry.
Yep.
I'm Melinda Vitalik. I'm a principal with Inkbuild Architecture. We are a woman-owned firm here located in Portland, Oregon, and we've always prioritized working for folks that maybe have the least access to design and to architecture, and kind of bringing, justice for people on the planet through design. This is something we truly believe in, is at the heart of our mission. So we focused mostly on affordable housing and creating housing at the whole spectrum of housing, everything from sheltering, permanent supportive housing, apartments, affordable home ownership. We work on a lot of different kinds of projects in addition to some of the commercial work that we do. And I would say that the Beaverton Shelter Project is kind of a blend of the two of those in a lot of ways. But I've been working for over 30 years in the industry, worked for various firms until I met Andrea 10, 11 years ago, something like that. And we started Inkbuild Architecture 9 years ago. Andrea, do you want to do a little intro for yourself?
Yeah,
Add
sure.
on?
Yeah, so I'm Andrea Wallace. I'm also one of the principals here at Inkbuild Architecture, and I kind of led a lot of the main interior design for the Beaverton Shelter project. Mel was the principal in charge and the main project manager. So you're going to hear kind of both sides. I'm going to talk a bit about the trauma-informed design and some of the collaborative process we did with the client. And then Mel's going to talk about a lot of the building efficiency and kind of existing building conditions. So you kind of get a big picture of the process that we went through in designing the shelter. And I just wanted to kind of start off by kind of setting the precedent of the task that we were faced with, because as many of you know, Oregon does have a pretty high rate of houselessness. And in 2024, so for reference, the Beaverton shelter did open in basically December of 2024. I jokingly said that I was turning 40 on December 1st, and I wanted those doors open. And sure enough, we did the ribbon cutting back in November, and the first residents were kind of moving in the first week of December of 2024. So that was fantastic. But basically, January of that year, the HUD numbers that were reported, they do that as a point in time, like one day in January, they do a count. And for 2024, that number, the official number was 22,875 people in Oregon experiencing houselessness. And of those people, 62% of them are unsheltered or were unsheltered January of 2024. Since then, those numbers have continued to go up. And Oregon had been, and it continues to be, basically the eighth largest, has the eighth largest houseless population in the United States. And then if we were to jump forward into 2025, so you can kind of see those numbers, it went from almost 23,000 up to 27,000. So you're seeing an increase of houselessness that is continuing to occur. And that was an increase of roughly 18.6% between 2024 and 2025. 1 out of 158 Oregon residents are experiencing houselessness. So like the problem that we have here is pretty significant. And while I think that we're doing a lot of great things, there's still a lot of work to be done, but it's not just in shelter, it's the entire continuum of housing, right? So when we're talking about the continuum of housing, and we're talking about how we interacted with the county later in the presentation, this is kind of what we're talking about, where the county, Washington County, they are really addressing it across the whole spectrum, and they're bringing on additional shelters, they're bringing on additional permanent supportive housing, they're bringing on more affordable housing. They're doing a great job at repurposing and rehabilitating their existing housing stock, and maintaining affordability for the residents of Washington County. But this is just one piece of that continuum. So when we started talking about like how many beds and how many men versus women, we were really looking at it from a perspective of being one piece of this overall puzzle trying to solve. So that's going to come up here in a little bit. But basically between 2023 and 2024, right when a lot of this is happening and continuing to happen, Washington County did report about a 35.5% reduction in unsheltered homelessness. So that's fantastic that we're seeing that trend down in Washington County. We want to see that happen across the state. We all know that there's a lot of work to be done there. But I just wanted to kind of like give that broader picture about where we were at when we were kind of tasked with bringing on this project and state, you know, like we came at this as designers without lived experience. And so we will describe a bit of the process, but understanding the task was kind of the first hurdle. And then Mel, if you want to talk about the funding.
So the City of Beaverton was our client for this project, but Washington County and the SHS dollars that were coming from Washington County to fund a lot of these sheltering projects around the county, they were also a partner. So the county, Beaverton, and a whole advisory team that Andrea will expand about later were involved in the design process for this project from day one. We spent the first 2 or 3 months just going through a super collaborative design process. But before that, the city of Beaverton put this project out for RFP. They had already identified the site and purchased the site, and they kind of intentionally purchased the site without a lot of public input. They decided where it was going to go and made that decision. It was one of their strategic decisions for the process to kind of reduce some of the time and energy and things that can happen with when the entire community is having a say on the sites of, you know, affordable housing projects. I think we've all been on the ends of those conversations as well, and then also shelters. So they had already purchased this building. It's a single-story retail building, really close to 217 at the intersection of Beaverton Hillsdale and 217. It was an existing mattress store for most of it, and then part of it had a dental clinic that was in there as well. So just single-story retail building built in the late 70s, early 80s, as you can imagine, everything that comes with that. An existing site that had parking in the front and the back, and right adjacent to a Goodwill, next door to a Goodwill, and then another building in the back to the south that was housing a bunch of attorneys and just small offices of some law firms and things like that were back there. So, and then they used county funds and a variety of grants and other things that they went after to make up this $14 million cost for the building. And that's including everything. That's acquisition, that's some city costs, and that's everything that they put into the project as we went through it.
And as Mel mentioned, that we were from the very get-go when we were brought in through this RFP process, the city had decided to create basically a task force team of local service providers and shelter providers. That was fantastic. Their insight was invaluable. Like the amount of feedback that they provided and the process that we went through with them is how the shelter came to be what it is today. And so this is kind of the group that was kind of put together as our main core decision-making / advice team, if you will. And then we also had the opportunity to go and tour a handful of shelters. And through this collaborative design process, we started with just overarching goal setting so we could really understand what was at the heart of what the City of Beaverton wanted to establish here and what a good shelter really meant, and getting the feedback from the service providers as to like, what do these things mean? So the city had kind of hope and community and cultural responsiveness as their top 3 goals, but like, what does hope mean in shelter, and what does community mean in shelter, and what does being culturally responsive mean in shelter? And so kind of sussing a lot of that information out from the team, we did a series of surveys out to the advice team as well. And then we also did a handful of just collaborative design sessions, both internally here in our office with some of our consultants, as well as like more publicly, where they kind of rented out a large ground floor space at the Beaverton Library. And we held a session where we kind of had the floor plan and all of the programmatic elements that we determined through our surveying of like what could or should be in this shelter. And then broke out into groups and created different concept designs of like how to lay out the building and which of those programmatic elements were the most important. So the different plans had different elements that the different teams found to be important to what they were trying to achieve in their shelter design. And a lot of what you're going to see is like pieces of each of these coming together into the final plan. So we had a conversation about like, what if there's like a tree or an element inside the space, and how could that connect inside and outside? And then, I'll get to the beds here in a bit, but just again, where it's like, oh, what if we put all the beds to one side, or do we want to separate beds, like men's side versus women's side, and then have things up the middle? You'll start to see where it's like, oh, we've got the beds all to one side, but we do have the tree element, and we do have the kitchen in this location. So as we get to the final design, we actually modeled all of these different kind of concepts that the collaborative kind of workshop created, so that way we could really see how that fit like more accurately using our computer software. And then we were able to really kind of pick apart what's working and what's not working on each of them, and kind of came up with a final shelter design. And so you're seeing that kind of progression happen directly with that team. And there's a couple of really key elements that I think really make the space what it is. And part of them were just established in those collaborative sessions. And I think having both those provider feedback as well as the client present for those conversations, bought in on those conversations, it actually really helped reinforce that as we got into construction, as you start facing constructability issues, as you start facing VE and kind of cost constraints. There were pieces that were just so sacred to the project that, it would be an easy thing to say, okay, let's take the tree and the skylight out and save some money. But they became such the heart of the project. And even to this day are so important to how the space is functioning and how it makes the space beneficial to the guests, that it wasn't even on the table. So I would say, like, moving forward, for any designers out there, getting that type of buy-in, having a collaborative process with your client, with any kind of stakeholders at the table, really helps reinforce some of those elements. So then we're all bought in on the same things. One of the other things we did is we started looking at how do we orient the beds? How do we give people safe places to live, basically, when they're in shelter? And we looked at, there's all this is also like coming out of COVID, there's all this extra like office cubicles and all these empty offices in downtown Portland. Do we like repurpose cubicles because they've got like acoustic properties, and like we could create these like cubbies out of cubicles? And one of the shelter providers had given us an example of a shelter that they really appreciated, that had the bunk beds all around kind of a centralized locker space. But then we also did a questionnaire with the team and heard the statement that 80% of conflict experienced in shelters actually stem from utilizing bunk beds. And there's kind of two components to that. One is there's a handful of folks that won't even come into shelter, because most of our open beds, when we talk about open beds in shelters in Oregon, most of those are top bunks. And nobody wants to be in a top bunk. They would rather stay in their tent on the sidewalk than come into a shelter and be forced to sleep in a top bunk. And a lot of folks experiencing houselessness have real health issues with their feet and with mobility, and getting in and out of a top bunk is also unreasonable to ask that of them. And people don't like sleeping on top of each other. And so we made the conscious decision. Oh, in addition, we asked the team, there's kind of two parts to this. We heard the statement that they said 80% of conflicts happen around bunk beds, as we're talking about these bunk bed designs. And then we asked the team at one point, like, okay, hypothetically, if you were designing a shelter, what's one thing that you would do if you didn't have to worry about budget or time or any of our current worldly challenges? What's something that you would do to make a congregate shelter successful? And almost every single person instantly said, I would never design a congregate shelter then. And we're like, okay, well, can you expand on that? And it came out really clearly that, you know, people want autonomy over their space. They want a place that's their own. And so we're like, okay, we can work with this as designers. We're creating a congregate shelter, but we're kind of like deconstructing this idea of congregate shelter. Um, and so we ended up creating kind of this in between where we needed to provide a space when we're talking about trauma-informed design, and we'll get into some of the other components here in a minute, but I wanted to kind of talk about the beds. When we're talking about space, we need acoustical transparency, or some way to know that if something were to be happening, they weren't in an individual room that somebody could like lock themselves into. And so we needed to be able to have access to those spaces, but still maintain privacy and autonomy of space. So we designed these kind of sleeping pods, if you will, to have lockable storage lockers. One of them actually doubles as a nightstand. They have a curtain that they can close for privacy, but the walls you're seeing are not going all the way up to the ceiling. And that allows them to have a little bit of that acoustical transparency across the space as they're doing their kind of staff oversight over the sleeping rooms. And you're also going to see, I mean, I don't have the plan now, but I could always go back to it. All of the spaces are designed where there's no dead end corridors. So everything, it does kind of feel a little bit like a maze as you're in here. We did some things with color on the acoustic panels up above and the color that you're seeing on the laminate wall cladding to kind of increase the durability of the walls, while also providing kind of a wayfinding device of like where you are within this overall sleeping room so you can find your pod really easily. We added this white erase board at the actual entry of those so they can write notes to people. They can tell them when they have an appointment. They can say, hey, welcome to the shelter, or write notes to each other. So there is kind of a personalization that can happen right at your front door of your sleeping pod. But we did really want to capture the safety aspect of it. So that's part of the reason why they were designed the way that they were. When we're talking about kind of regenerative design goals and trauma-informed design and how they apply to this project, you know, the design needs of a traditional project potentially don't necessarily meet the needs of folks experiencing houselessness and our shelter guests. So a lot of things were added to the project, like 2 doors out of every space. So even if it's a small meeting room, if it's a large meeting room, if it's a flex art space, there's always 2 means of egress out of any space. So if there is a conflict or something is happening, this person can still remove themselves from the space and not necessarily be trapped in it. You know, we have a space that's a sensory refuge space. We started with it being called a de-escalation space, but it really is meant to be more about sensory calming. And it was interesting to hear from the service provider after the fact, now that they've utilized it. The sensory space was one that they originally had not had a sign up sheet or programmed it. They just thought people would come and go as they needed it. It was so popular that they actually have to create a sign up sheet for the sensory space. So that's something that if you are going to be working on shelters, I don't think you could have enough of that. You know, those spaces for people to just go in and decompress. If they are feeling really anxious, if they are feeling escalated feelings or stressors, to be able to have a place that they can excuse themselves and calm down and self-regulate is really key. And that's been, you know, eye-opening to hear how much that they've wanted that. Creating spaces that are totally inclusive, that they're for different body types, different abilities, different body sizes, having a variety of seating options, a variety of chair sizes, some with arms, some without arms, is really critical to making sure that we can meet the needs of the entire community. And one of the things that we utilized on this project, and we tend to move forward on most of our projects, is something called the Kelsey standards. If you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend you look into it. It's essentially a guide or a certification, if you will. It's a self-certification, almost like a LEED accreditation, but it's for increased inclusivity and accessibility. And it captures a lot of really great points that don't necessarily get met in our traditional ADA codes. So I definitely would recommend looking into that. I don't have enough time today to get into it, but we did utilize the Kelsey standards on this project quite a bit. And then we also implemented a lot of biophilic elements, access to natural materials, access to daylight, and actually bringing both, you know, planted materials inside the building and out, and having those kind of connect. And then we were definitely tasked with meeting the Beaverton's climate resilience goals, and Mel's going to talk about that here in a minute. And then also just health and wellness is such a huge priority. And hopefully that's reflected in the design that you're going to see. I just skipped a slide. That was, sorry, let me go back one. When we're talking about that safety and trust, choice and empowerment, connection and community, all of these kind of tenets of trauma-informed design, we did create this slide, and I'm not going to go through all of them. You're welcome to screenshot if you're really all that interested, but essentially a lot of the things that I've already described, the kind of no dead-end corridors, redundant entries, access to resources. We utilized window films so that, and we strategically placed them to certain heights so you can still see the sky, you can still see the leaves of the trees, but you can still get quite a bit of privacy within the space while without restricting daylight, because we really wanted the space to feel bright. But we did implement quite a few design features that are very specifically addressing trauma-informed design principles. As you see here, like pretty much everything ties to more than one of those tenets. Like everything is very well interconnected. And one of the main primary design kind of influences or kind of concepts that we brought forward was this idea of a ripple, that this shelter is going to be something that we really want to have a positive impact that ripples out into the community at a broader scale, and that people can come here and really feel connected to each other. They can feel connected to the service providers that are helping support them, and they can help heal and then bring that out into their community as well. So I've got a couple of slides here that just kind of were our like mood board, if you will, of what we were trying to achieve with the interior design, as well as kind of just a soft palette, simplified, so you can kind of understand where that was coming from. But again, utilizing natural materials, even sometimes those maybe needed to be a laminate or a plastic, just from a durability aspect, especially with this type of project. When we toured the other shelters, we're seeing, like chairs just like destroying drywall everywhere in the dining rooms. And so we just wanted to make sure that like we do create a space that's going to last the length of time is needed, and that as it's being used, it's not something that's going to just kind of disintegrate around the folks that are utilizing it. So this is kind of, I'm going to go through a couple quick before and afters. This is kind of the before of and in general, some after photos. This was the final design for the exterior. We kind of left the rest of the building alone, and we added some playfulness with the films across the windows to create that level of privacy while also bringing in some color. And then again, leaving that upper section of it transparent so that way you get access to seeing the sky, and kind of getting playful with the color across the brick there. The other thing that we also didn't want to just like put a big sign out here that says like, here, I'm a shelter, come here, because Washington County has very specific in intake processes that people get assigned to their shelters when they go through the intake. So it's not necessarily a walk-up shelter. They do have some beds reserved for nightly guests, but in general, people will enter kind of a shelter program here. It's expected that they're going to stay here. I want to say it was 30 days, but they could go, or maybe it's 90 days and they could extend past that as long as they were engaging in services. So their goal was to kind of have a 30-day window. The program was the 90 days, and then they could stay as long as they needed to get into permanent housing, as long as they were engaging with the service provider, which for this project ended up being Open Door Housing Works, and they were on our task force team as well. So you saw a glimpse there of the mattress store as it was emptied out. This is the new lobby space. The other really key piece that brought this project to life was actually being able to work with a local artist. The City of Beaverton has a 1% for the art program, and we were able to utilize some of those dollars to help select a muralist to come in and do some murals for the building, as well as he's providing the shelter guests with a 1-year residency art program. But it was really fantastic to be part of the process to select this individual. He actually had lived experience with houselessness coming out of incarceration, and he's just a fantastic human and did such a beautiful job of bringing this vision to life and bringing a lot of color into the space and letting it be kind of a reflection of the area and the neighborhood. This is again just the lobby, having a variety of kind of some soft seating up front as like a little bit of a landing pad. And then the project also, as Mel was describing some of the funding sources, one of those was actually earmarked dollars for a coordinated care space. So we actually have some exam clinic spaces as well as doctor office space and a separate kind of restroom facility. It was intentionally placed where they could close that off from the shelter. So if Washington County at any time did need to open that up to guests that were not part of the shelter, we didn't want those folks to be coming into the shelter and disrupting the guests that live there. And so it actually has its own entry door, and then it's also connected to the shelter, so you don't have to go outside, but it is kind of positioned in a way that it can function as a standalone kind of clinic space. In our intake space, we also utilized just some really simple paint scheme measures. It was funny enough, the painter was like, what do you mean swoops? I need some help here. So I came out on site and chalked the lines for where we wanted the paint to go, both on the exterior and on the interior. But it was a really simple way to add a little bit of variety into these spaces, have a little pop of color and some playfulness without really increasing costs. It was something that a painter can simply come in and do that and tape that off. The guests themselves, as they stay here, utilize kind of shared shower facilities. So we want to, and I apologize that I didn't include a picture of it, but just to the left on this photo is the laundry area that has a glazed storefront. Kind of view into it. The reason to do that is a lot of folks that are experiencing houselessness don't like to leave their belongings unattended. So we actually purposefully placed kind of this folding table space in the center here that doubles as a vanity. So if you're getting ready in the morning and you don't want to necessarily do that in the shared bathroom, there is a space outside of the bathroom for you to be able to do your hair, makeup, or whatnot, kind of get ready for the day. And then there's also a place to sit around this kind of folding table station and watch your laundry or wait for your shower. So it's kind of a secondary landing zone. Again, you're seeing that kind of circular circulation is really important. The restrooms are shared. There is a male identifying and a female identifying restroom. And then all of the shower rooms have kind of the pull cords for safety measures if somebody does need help. And they have an area to kind of hang belongings, set belongings on a bench. And then they are all ADA compliant. Restrooms. This is the sensory room I was describing, not fully furnished yet, but in this photo, but the wood texture there is really fantastic. People walk in and instantly start touching the wall. It's got a variety of ways to adjust the lighting in the space, and I think they've implemented a sound machine in here as well now. And then core to the center of the design was a tree that we did open up the roof structure to allow a lot of daylight into the core of the building. So that kind of doubles as providing daylight to all of the ancillary spaces around that tree, but also providing enough daylight for the tree to survive and thrive. It was fantastic to see it kind of around the kind of Christmas time. They had decorated it with notes and different ornaments, and they kind of do stuff with the tree throughout the year. We created a variety of seating around that. There's some bistro tables style seating. There's an extension of the dining room table, as well as some benches and pillows. And you're around that tree is also a handful of other small spaces. So a small lounge space, a reading nook that you're kind of seeing in the background on the right. There's a flex art space that actually has a glazed wall that you can see into the center here. It allows that daylight to come into that space, but that's where the artists can come in and do their residency. And the intake rooms and offices are off to the left side. So that's kind of just another view of that. You're also seeing some kind of swooping short height walls that are meant for that variety of seating where people can kind of sit down and not necessarily have somebody like right behind you, but you can still see through the space. We utilized a combination of both the wood slat screens and the short walls to kind of provide that variety and choice. So here's the lovely Mel and Sherry sitting in the soft seating area there. And that was just kind of a picture of before that mattress store. That was the back break room. Now, once we kind of cleaned that all out, this is what the dining room ended up looking like. In the left of this photo, we'll rotate here in a second. You'll be able to see we added some storefront to connect to the outdoor backyard space. And then this was another mural that the muralist did. And then this is the dining room area facing the kitchen with that access to nature and connection to the outdoor patio space. little self-serve station. And I'll hand it over to Mel to talk about the outdoors.
So I guess one of the key themes for this project and the way that we were trying to address trauma-informed space for folks experiencing houselessness was really giving them a variety of types and sizes of spaces and places to sit and places to congregate so that different groups of people could hang out in the same space. And we took that all the way out to the back. So that, as I had mentioned in the beginning, there were two parking areas, one in the front facing Beaverton Hillsdale, and then another parking area in the back to the south side. And we turned the south parking lot into the outdoor space for this shelter. Um, so there's a variety of seating. We tried to still bring some of those elements from the interior design and the the round and the circle shapes. And then there's also kind of out of frame, but on the left-hand side, there's another tree. So it's the third tree. There's a tree at the entry. There's a tree in the middle of this space on the interior. And then there's this other tree in the back, um, the kind of the third piece of the ripples. But we also, and I'll get into some of the sustainability and energy efficiency measures that we took in a minute, but this is a good shot of the solar panels that we incorporated into this project. We built a separate canopy in the back so that they could have covered outdoor space year round, obviously. And this is located in Beaverton. We have lots of rain. And so giving space that people could still be outside in the dry. This canopy kind of has two sides of it, one with a barrier down the middle, just to kind of separate folks that want to go outside and smoke and those that don't, understanding that, you know, smoke travels, but it just at least gives us some separation of space. The raised, those aluminum beds that you see are raised garden beds that the shelter and open door may incorporate into kind of some gardening programming for the space, but we kind of left that up to the shelter operator on how they wanted to do it. And in the meantime, planted some like herbaceous woody herbs and things like that in there. There's three containers. The green that you can see over to the right are additional storage for the space. This whole building is 12,000 square feet, and trying to fit 60 bed shelter plus all of the kind of shared spaces that are required for the shelter, and then offices for the folks that are operating the shelter and the care facility and everything else that was in there. You you still start really limiting the amount of storage, and it's such a big issue for shelters to have enough storage for folks' things while they're in the shelter process. So we added some containers and then we painted them bright colors so that they could kind of fit in with the rest of it and not just feel like these big things on the side. They also kind of help put a barrier between this outdoor space and the on-ramp to 217, which is right behind it. And in addition to the little bubbling fountain, kind of trying to de-emphasize the fact that we're right next to a freeway and that folks are wanting to use this outdoor space. Jumping into the sustainability pieces. So Beaverton has a climate action plan that they put together in 2019, and all of their, any other projects that are using city funds are required to meet some of those requirements. One of the biggest ones that came out of that is that they require having an EV charging station at each of their locations. And so we incorporated one of those as well into the front of the front parking area. The solar array that we showed you on the canopy is actually supplying almost a quarter of the energy for the whole shelter. We pursued path net zero and achieved that for this project. Obviously, it's an existing retail building that had some old rooftop units. There were 3 or 4 of them on top of the roof. And we replaced those with some super high efficiency outdoor, direct outdoor air mechanical systems, with also trying to keep in mind that, you know, the climate is changing and, you know, we've all experienced major fires in the vicinity of our cities in Oregon. And so just making sure that we had enough ventilation that we could also make sure that it's a safe space for folks during kind of fire issues and air quality issues that are outside. This, I guess it's a good time to note also that this was done with some emergency shelter dollars from Washington County, and they have a whole list of requirements that you have to meet to receive those funds. And part of those is making the building super resilient in the case of any emergency. So this building also has a sizable
Generator.
generator. Thank you. Sorry, it's my brain and my age, like losing names of things. So it has a large generator also that will generate power for this facility. So if everyone in Beaverton lost their power, they'd still be operational at this shelter. All electric appliances, obviously, low flow plumbing fixtures, LED lighting, those are kind of the base things that I think we all at this point incorporate into our projects. The other thing that we added to this building was upgrading the exterior envelope. And honestly, we were planning to use this this air barrier that you can spray from the inside for this existing building and fill in all the cracks and get the air tightness that we needed to achieve. And it turned out that this building ended up having to be completely reskinned. As I mentioned, it was built in the late 70s, early 80s, and the brick, it turned out, was not really attached to the building in many places anymore. And so it was a big cost that we had to add into the project midway through. But the contractor was able to still finish on time, and we reskinned that entire building and achieved our air tightness that way by just reskinning it and putting a new weather barrier on the outside. Inside, there's a lot of additional daylighting. There's that large circular skylight over the tree that's in the middle, but there's also a lot of solar tubes that are throughout the building that we popped through the roof to just bring a bunch of daylight. And it's pretty substantial. So that the photo of the space outside of the shower rooms and the laundry is actually fully lit without lighting during the day because of just a few of those solar tubes in there. It's pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, especially during construction when you don't have the power onto the building. They actually didn't need a bunch of extra construction lights because the solar tubes provide enough daylight throughout the building. It was pretty crazy.
Yeah, I guess the only one I didn't talk about was the heat pump hot water heater. Also, because we had controlled the whole building, we'd put a really super high efficiency heat pump hot water system in here to run everything. There's a lot of showers that are happening at this building every single day. So that helped to save a lot of the energy, a lot on the energy as well. So we received some incentives from Energy Trust of Oregon for achieving the path to net zero. Those kind of incentives obviously don't cover the costs of adding the super efficient outdoor air system and VRF system that we've added into this building. However, the long-term savings on operating costs is huge, and it'll pay for itself very quickly. We threw in a bunch of slides that our mechanical engineer included in another presentation. So we're just sharing them with you and you can get copies of them.
This is essentially showing you the baseline of like what the baseline code building would be and what the proposed building would get down to. So an EUI for a typical building of this size, functioning as a shelter, would have an EUI of 83. Our proposed building was getting us to 16. And then with PV, we were able to get down to an EUI of 9. And then this slide is basically explaining how to get from that 38 down to R9, is showing each of those different things and what they did to bring that EUI down. So our air sealing was getting us about 2 EUI, then adding another 3 or so or just under for the energy efficiency lighting. And again, as you can kind of see, Mel mentioned that we do have that. Basically, it's a VRF DOAS system that we'll talk about here in just a second, but that was a big chunk of it. And then getting down a little bit farther with that solar array.
So these are some photos of some of those systems, the solar array racking being installed, the blower door test from the upper left, we needed the air tightness needed to come down for reasons for just having a more efficient building and reducing those energy costs, but also because of the new energy codes and the building code. This building would have required a vestibule space, but you can get around that by just having a tighter envelope. And so that was pretty simple to achieve, and then you just have to do your blower door test as part of
Yeah,
that.
so we also didn't have to install the air curtains, which would have had an increase of energy usage. We were able to bypass both the vestibule and air curtain requirement by getting our air tightness down.
And then, we have 2 of those blue units on the roof. You can see it from 217.
Which are these?
Which,
And again, we
our,
included this from our mechanical engineer. If anybody's not familiar with the VRF DOAS system, this is kind of a good slide that explains that and how we bring air into the building. It is fully filtered, fresh air, basically being brought in and tempered. So while houselessness has increased and we're making strides towards shelter access between 2023 and 2025, year-round shelter beds increased by about 39%, and the sheltered houselessness population increased by 50. So we were able to get more people access to shelter, and this is just one of the ways that we did that in Washington County. We flew through quite a bit, so we want to open up an opportunity for questions and to go back and explain anything or explain any of the kind of plan and the building plan, but we wanted to leave enough time there for that. And then we'll also provide you just with our contact information. You're always welcome to reach out to us directly if you have any questions that you'd like to follow up with.
Wow, thank you so much. I've heard you guys talk about this building a few times now. We featured you in one of our Allies for Efficiency, and I think I've heard you at another presentation, and I still pick up new things every time. It's just such a great project. So I would just, if you'd like to place questions in the chat, you're welcome to do that. But I would invite you to just come off mute and ask your questions as well. Please feel free. I don't know, maybe you.
I'll jump
Maybe
in. I just wanted to compliment the design team on a really beautiful design and being so thoughtful in your research to inform the design, which, as I know from doing a little bit of that, just takes so much effort and patience. So, kudos for having done that. I have a really technical question, which is, in your fresh air exchange system, you mentioned forest fire smoke. It's incredibly hard to filter out. PM2 is like smaller than a human hair by a couple of factors. Are you actually filtering out forest fire smoke in your system?
I would have to ask our mechanical engineer that question. I was under the impression we are, but that's a great comment, and I might have to follow up with that.
Well, I got excited when you said so because it's actually very difficult to do. It usually requires HEPA filtration. So
this does have HEPA filtration in it. So that's why,
well,
again, I believe it does, but I don't want to say that definitively and be wrong.
Okay. Okay, that's promising.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, great job.
Thank you so much. It does look like there's a couple questions in the chat. Someone asked about the fabrication of the wood wall in the sensory room. That product is called, it's by Soldeberg, Soldeberg, I believe. And it's a paneled, it's like already prefabricated, panelized, and you can select different types of kind of carve patterns and wood types, and they have a whole bunch of options. We love them for that. And I'm happy. Oh, I will actually put a link to that website in the chat for you.
I'll take the access control and management for residents. This was, we had to, as you can imagine, there were a lot of design topics to have conversations with our advisory team over. But doing the access control and that kind of management, we made a lot of decisions as part of this advisory team that had multiple operators in it, and Open Door ended up operating it. And I think that we tried to make the best decision and make the building be as flexible as possible for the way that different shelter operators work in those spaces. So for this one, we have access control at all the exterior doors. There's also access control for any of the, I believe, like to the break room, so that staff can actually come in through the back of the building and through the break room and not have to come through the main spaces of the shelter. There were a lot of decisions that were that had to be made with the operator and figuring out how they're going to use this space specifically. But yeah, the residents are limited to what they have access to. They don't have access to the kitchen unless they're, being given that. They don't have access to the back spaces where the heat pump water heaters are and any of the, there's also another laundry machine that we added post occupancy that Open Door needed for just doing their own laundry for the shelter into those back areas. Project cost per bed, I've actually never calculated that out. The construction costs ended up being 8.7 million on this project. And again, that's because we also reskinned the entire building.
Yeah, so I can do that math real quick.
Yeah, and in particular, this shelter, our intent was to shelter individual adults. And we had originally had 12 beds for women and 48 beds for men, male identifying and female identifying. And in actuality, Washington County has kind of changed the way that they're using this space. And because it is so accessible and that we had taken in a lot of the Kelsey standards into this space and made it a super accessible space, and each person only has a cot in their own space, it's become, there's a lot more older single women that are in this shelter now than there are anyone else. And so it's the areas have kind of flipped, and they've had to rearrange the way that they monitor and manage the bunk room spaces, basically. Yeah. So families get directed to other housing in their continuum of care. So they have a lot of hotel rooms, especially like old hotel motels that have been converted also into housing, and a lot of families stay in those spaces instead of this kind of a congregate shelter. Yeah.
I will add another just word of advice for anybody working in shelter. One of the things that we experienced after the fact was that while we had this really great task force team that provided a lot of insight, the kitchen became a discussion like so much. And we're trying to decide what type of kitchen are we providing, and the city's trying to understand what type of an investment into a commercial kitchen or kitchen facilities do they want to make. And so it was decided during the design process prior to the actual service provider being selected that we were going to have more of a warming kitchen. Most of the service providers on the task force team said that they would probably never actually prep food here or do any full cooking. They would just kind of do warming and have food delivered. And so the kitchen was designed for that, for a warming kitchen. And the service provider that did end up getting selected actually does do all of their own food prep typically. And so that became an issue where they didn't have the level of kitchen needs met in the kitchen space. We're actually working with them on an access center and their own headquarter building, and it will have a full commercial kitchen that they'll be able to bring food to the shelter and others throughout the region. But that was kind of an interesting point. I would say making sure that you kind of understand every shelter provider has very different ways that they interact with guests, that they need for storage, that they have for kitchen and how they function. And they have different programs. And so making sure that you're actually working with service providers that would be utilizing the building. They also change over time, where sometimes they'll their contract will end and a new service provider will be selected. So it's obviously not going to be 100% certain that you'll be able to design something for every situation. But I would say the kitchen became one of the things that at the end was like, man, I wish we would have had selected the service provider, had their full say in the kitchen design prior to finalizing the design of the project, because it would have made them a little bit more successful.
Yeah. Some of the key items that we incorporated from the Kelsey standards, the biggest one I think is adding 42-inch wide doors. So Andrea kind of explained that each room has 2 doors into and out of the space. So at least one of those is a 42-inch wide door, and that accommodates folks that are in kind of the bigger motorized mobility devices and things that exist today that is, sometimes don't even fit through a 36-inch wide door. We also added additional signage and kind of wayfinding directions within the shelter so everybody knows where the hygiene areas are and where you can take your bikes to park them. I guess I didn't really talk about that. There's also a pet relief area in the back patio area and a bike repair station for folks to use that need it. This shelter is very low barrier, so pets are welcome and they're expected to keep them in their little pod space with them at all times. Is there anything else from Kelsey standards, Andrea, that you
I
can think
mean,
of?
there were several, and you hit the main ones off the top of my head. There was definitely things about color and wayfinding were a
Yeah.
huge piece, but there's a lot of different nuanced things that we did when it came to that. And so the Kelsey standards also focus on folks that are maybe experiencing a type of disability that's not a traditional like in a wheelchair ADA, right? Like actually the amount of population that in the United States or the globally that is experiencing some level of disability, whether it's a cognitive disability, whether it's hearing, vision loss, whether it's mobility constraint, it's like the numbers are actually staggering. I forget now, I've heard them speak at the Kelsey Standards. I want to say it was something like 80% of people or something. It's a much higher number than you expect to hear. And it's because there are so many different types of disability. So there are a lot of things, whether it's tactile, whether it's use of color, whether it was like auditory devices or like the pull cords with the lights. There was a handful of things that all kind of tied back to ways to bring the Kelsey standards forward. But some of the bigger things that Mel mentioned is that the actual added size for the doors and turning radiuses are actually made more for motorized wheelchairs versus like a traditional push wheelchair. So that type of thing is something that we definitely increased some of the circulation paths and doors and stuff, made space for that for those.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it looks like Kirk has kind of a parting thought here. Well, thank you for that. Well, it looks like we're kind of winding down here. Do you guys have maybe just kind of one last thought to leave everyone with on our way out here? Maybe just one
mean,
one kind of final thought. Yeah.
I think that we agree, adaptive reuse of our existing building stock is kind of the best thing that we can do as architects from a sustainability side. And that's actually how Andrea and I met, was working for a firm that was doing super sustainable and also high-end apartments. But we took that passion and kind of brought it to these kind of projects and other affordable housing, and we bring it to everyone.
And we are not gatekeepers. We believe
No.
that design is better when we collaborate. So if anybody ever wants to reach out, ask for any advice, things that we did, want to know more about the project, want to know ways to implement that in your own work, please reach out. Like, we are never one, like there is no secret sauce here. We just want to really create better spaces for humans to exist in. And I think we can do a better job of that if we put more brains together to make that happen. So feel free to reach out
Yeah.
anytime.
Oh, thank you so much. That is so inspirational. And thank you everyone for joining us today. On behalf of AIA COTE, we absolutely appreciated each of you joining us today. So thank you very much. And I hope you guys have a wonderful evening and great rest of your week. And we'll see you in a couple months for our next one.